Here is a few instances of where they tell you that they're going to lie. This is the first chairman of the UN's Climate Panel Science Panel, Sir John Horton. He wrote in a book on the subject, "Unless we announce disasters, no one will listen." Stephen Schneider, who says we have to offer up scary scenarios. Then Stephen Guilbeault of Greenpeace, global warming can mean colder. It can mean drier. It can mean wetter. That's what we're talking about. Where do they find this?
We fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing ground.
Thank you for joining us. You are listening to A Radio, and this is the Morning Moment. We're on weekdays, 11:45 Eastern. Follow us on Spreaker.com and click on the like button. Now, this piece is from Macleans and other places. I'm going to read this piece, and I want to be fair and open-minded. Unlike these folk, you will be able to read the piece or pieces when I post them online. After reading the piece, I'm going to give you my response, and I hope you will consider it and pass it on. I don't reach tens of thousands, if not millions, like some folk do, but I ask you to consider this. And if you think there's a scintilla of logic in those thoughts, please pass this piece on. Here's that piece. It comes from many pieces, but it's all the same subject. And it's all to do with Catherine McKenna and a non-stop attack on those people who have a different view. I think we're entitled to a different view in a, quote, free country. Here are those pieces. It starts off, I think it's from her Twitter page. The science is clear. Canada's climate has warmed and will warm further in the future, driven by human influence. Please remember that phrase till later on. Driven by human influence. This will impact our environment, our economy, and our health. In fact, we've already seen it, but we can still take action together. Catherine McKenna. And here's another piece. Back in the spring of 2016, when images of voracious forest fires menaced Fort McMurray, Alberta, where the dominating news reporters asked Prime Minister Justin Trudeau if climate change was to blame. Unofficial capital of Alberta's oil sands, Fort McMurray figures prominently in the bitter debate over fossil fuels and global warming. Notice they call it global warming this time, not climate change. So Trudeau responded carefully. It's well known that one of the consequences of climate change will be a greater prevalence of extreme weather events around the planet, he allowed, before quickly adding, pointing at any one incident and saying, this is because of that, is neither helpful nor entirely accurate. Trudeau drew criticism from some who thought he had missed a chance to highlight the heavy price humanity is already paying for making the planet hotter and drier. But his answer was pretty standard political dodge at the time. Even the Green Party leader Elizabeth May said no credible climate scientist would draw a neat cause and effect link between climate change and the Fort McMurray fire. Then the NDP leader Thomas Mulcair said it's not time to start laying blame. A lot has changed though in the past 3 years. During severe flooding in eastern Canada this spring, for instance, Trudeau didn't hesitate to raise the alarm about climate change. Canadians are already seeing costs, he said. Other Liberals were even more outspoken. Yes, climate change is real, said MP Will Amos, whose Quebec riding on the Ottawa River was hit badly by the floods. Yes, it is wreaking havoc on our infrastructure. Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodall, that genius, the senior voice from Western Canada in Trudeau's cabinet, linked global warming to the floods. Oh, it's global warming now. I thought it was climate change. Okay. as well as fires on the prairie grasslands in the boreal forests. Goodall said he didn't want to get into partisan argument, but stressed, "I think we all have to learn the lessons of climate change." So it's climate change again now, not global warming. "The impacts here are powerful and dangerous and damaging," unquote. The shift from pussyfooting around how climate change leads to a more extreme weather event to talking about it so forcefully hasn't happened by chance. It's the result of a concerted effort by researchers to create a new field called attribution science. Has anyone ever heard of that? I don't think so. That's a new one on me. The challenge they faced was that the climate is so complicated that teasing out a single cause for, say, a flood, a fire, is impossible. So they devised methods for calculating how much climate change had contributed. The Watershed Report was published by researchers from the University of Oxford in 2004, explaining how global warming caused by humans, please remember that phrase again please, caused by humans, had at least double the risk of the heatwave that baked Europe the previous year. Since that landmark study, attribution science has taken off, including in Canada. The federal government's Canada's Changing Climate Report, released earlier this year, listed 14 Canadian attribution studies published from 2015 to 17 on everything from forest fires to flooding to thinning Arctic ice. Actually, that's increasing. I'm sorry to make a comment, but I can't let that go. Arctic ice is actually increased. That's not true. But never mind, that's just incidental. Why tell the truth? Don't let that get in the way. The piece continues. In a widely noted report, Environment Canada researchers analysed the awful 2017 forest fire season in BC when 65,000 people were driven from their homes and millions left breathing smoke-filled air. They concluded that the extreme summer temperatures behind those fires were made more than 20 times more likely by human-caused climate change. Remember that term again, please. Human-caused climate change. Megan Kirschmere-Young, an Environment Canada climate scientist and one of the report's leading authors, said the research team ran 50 sophisticated computer simulations modelling the way BC's climate change depending on tiny tweaks. We can run the simulations of our climate considering all the emissions that humans have done. Humans. With just natural factors, and we can compare the types of extreme events we see in the two scenarios, or how frequent they are, she said. The researchers working on attribution studies, like Kirschmere-Young, tend to be acutely aware that their work isn't the typical kind of scientific study that's conducted without much attention to political debate. These studies are in part intended to make the public see climate change not in terms of vague impacts in the hazy future, but about fresh memories and real damage done. It can help people relate to climate change, said Kirschmere-Young. You are talking about climate change in terms of how it increased the odds of an extreme event that they've either heard of or experienced themselves. But is the message getting through? According to a poll released earlier this year by the Associated Press, NORC, that's NORAC, Centre for Public Affairs Research and Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, fully 74% of Americans say their opinion on climate change has been influenced over the past 5 years by extreme weather. Polling by Eco-Analytics, a Canadian joint venture of charities, non-profit groups and academics, meant to provide research support to the environmental movement, found that in 2017 and again in 2018, more than half of Canadians thought that climate change was already harming people in Canada, up dramatically from about a third of those people polled in 2014. No comment. Eric Lapashbel, an associate professor of political science at Montreal University and eco-analytics researcher, said the personal experience seems to be driving more Canadians to conclude that climate change is already upon them. Quote, "They are concerned about the seasons shifting and weather becoming increasingly severe, unpredictable and unreliable," Lapashbel said. Whether or not this concern about weather and climate translates into a ballot box issue remains an open question, but a distinct possibility we are likely to experience more extreme weather in Canada before the fall of the 2019 federal election, and that may prime the issue in the minds of the voters, unquote. As I said, no comment. Exactly what would it take for climate change to become a powerful vote-driving issue isn't clear. Increasingly urgent warnings from scientists stretch back at least to 1992, with the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit, that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was hatched. In the 2008 federal election, the Liberal leader, Stephen Dion, ran on his green shift plan to tax carbon and lost badly. But maybe successive years of fire, flood and weird weather will turn out to matter where solid science and innovative policy proposals failed. There are hints that in places where climate change already feels like an undeniable local problem, attitudes change. Prince Edward Island is a prime example. After the province's election earlier this spring, some outsiders assumed the new Premier Conservative Dennis King would join forces with fellow Tory premiers in New Brunswick, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan and Alberta to oppose Trudeau's carbon tax. Instead, King said, "I don't think Islanders want us to fight carbon tax. I think Islanders would like to work towards carbon reduction." As I said, no comment. Adam Furnesh wasn't surprised that a climate researcher moved to Charlottetown from Toronto 7 years ago to head the University of Prince Edward Island's Climate Research Unit. What do all these universities cost us, I wonder? Anyway, quote, "People always ask me, what's the community like? Many climate change deniers," Furnesh said, "and always I say, well, I haven't met one yet." Okay, the article continues on like that. I think you get the gist. Here's my comment. Here's the problem as I see it. They don't want to listen to anything other than their view. It's strange but true. First, as I said just a little while ago, the ice pack in the Arctic and Antarctic is actually increasing, not decreasing. I would describe that as an inconvenient truth, indeed. Second, I've been living in this country, Canada, for near on 20 years, and I have to say this, and it won't be popular, whether you like it or not. Without exception, every year the weather's been different. Because that's what weather is, because that's what the climate is. It's never the same. Not from one year to the next has it been the same. Yeah, that's climate change. That's true climate change. But they don't want to admit that. For instance, the snow last winter actually came earlier than normal. Climate change, they would say. Last summer was hot. Climate change. This winter in my area, the snow was quite bad. Climate change. Here's the problem. There are always experts who disagree, and there are experts that agree with Catherine McKenna's view. What's wrong with experts disagreeing about everything? That's what they're supposed to do. That's what scientists do. They're always trying to prove the point. You cannot conclude something based on a 5-year study. Drill a hole in the ground, analyse it, and you'll find what the weather was 10,000 years ago. Were human beings responsible for that? Obviously not. But they're not interested in hearing that. Quite frankly, it's only their view. And here's the common thread with all these folk. It's always just a decade away from complete and utter disaster for us. Always just a decade away. We only have a decade to act. 10 years or less. Otherwise the world will change beyond our control. Well, there are many experts out there, for which they refuse to comment on, who say that we can't have any effect on the climate and the weather. Now that may or may not be true, but Canada is just a pinprick on the emissions that the world creates. Compared with the whole world, we're just infinitesimal. We don't matter. Now they either don't want to admit that or refuse to acknowledge it. China and India are by far the biggest polluters. And then look at the rest of the Far East. What about the nearly 100 years of Soviet rule and the pollution they created? There are cities, whole cities in the former Soviet Union that are uninhabitable because they are so polluted. Is that our fault? No. And here's another very important point that they always forget to mention. The sun. What do I mean by that? The sun affects our weather more than anything that we could do or could possibly try to do to influence the future. Our arrogance, quite frankly, to think that we could affect our planet's environment to anything like the extent that the sun has an effect is, quite frankly, ridiculous. I will give you an example. The increase in sunspot activity has been and continues to have enormous consequences on our planet. But to think we can do anything about that is absurd. To think that whether you turn on a light, start a car, eat a vegetable, chop a tree, turn on an AC, build a road, buy clothes, etc., 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 can have an effect to the extent that one solar flare can is ridiculous. It's idiotic. One solar flare could actually wipe out all human existence. We live with that threat all the time. What are we going to do? Leave the planet? The answer, quite frankly, is not a knee-jerk reaction to something that we don't want to admit is out of our control. No, they'd rather tell people that you are the problem. Well, if that's the case, I want to ask this question to our illustrious leader in Canada, Mr. Trudeau, who is forcing onto Canadians massive tax increases that will have a radical effect on their standard of living and their way of life. Let's get to the bottom line, because in the end of the day, I hate these cliches, but it's true. At the end of the day, what does it boil down to? Everything boils down to one thing: humans. So, if Mr. Trudeau really believes in climate change, which human beings are responsible for, not gerbils, rabbits, bears, chipmunks, rats, etc., human beings, why is it that he is insisting on increasing the population of our country by millions and millions and more carbon footprints, as they are fond of describing you and me as? If Mr. Trudeau and others truly believe that it is us as a species that is responsible for climate change, it doesn't make any sense, does it, that he and they would advocate a massive, and I mean massive, increase in the population of Canada. That can only lead to one outcome: more development, more green space being used, more roads, more consumption of natural resources for farming, more demand for more and more and more of everything. No, it doesn't make sense if your real goal is to reduce our effect on our climate from our little country of Canada. You would, wouldn't you, try to reduce our effect of this land, reduce our impact, reduce our carbon footprint? No, the only reason you would do the opposite is if you didn't think either any of this would make any difference, or you had a totally different agenda. The real question is, are Canadians and for that matter North Americans as a whole, bright enough to see through the thin veil of hypocrisy to the real truth? That's the question, isn't it? What could be so important that you would upend your total way of life, yet contradict it all in the same sentence? To force on a society such a radical lifestyle change for the good of the planet while demanding that we allow massive influxes of migrants that would adversely affect all that we are trying to do to allegedly fix it seems illogical. Now something really doesn't add up, and we can only hope enough of you out there wake up before this, quote, transformation is complete. You can find more at aradio.wordpress.com, where you can find links to us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Gab, and email. We are also on Spotify. Just go to the podcast section and type Canadian Politics with a twist, and you'll find us. We are continuing to reach out to you, so please pass on the links. Please click on the follow button on Spreaker.com. You can listen to all our morning moments at Spreaker.com under A Radio. That's EHRADIO, A Radio. And please click on the like button. And you can now hear a weekend review of our podcasts on WHBJ DB, News Talk Radio. Join us and many others, and you can find all our podcasts and morning moments at aradio.wordpress.com. Click on the Morning Moments tab.